All right. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Going to talk with Daniele Bolelli today, the Drunken Taoist and host of History on Fire, of course. And I know a lot of people know who you are, but do you want to just say a little bit about yourself for those people who don't know you?
Sure. Podcast you mentioned. I write books, teach college, that kind of stuff.
And you teach history, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So, yeah, we wanted to talk about some fun topics like Buddhism, porn, prostitution, and Musashi. All fun things to talk about. So, we don't have to do those in any particular order necessarily, but yeah, I thought about talking with you about Buddhism mostly because I really enjoyed your conversations with Duncan Trussell about it on his podcast. And
Right.
I think we might have talked about, I don't remember for sure, but we might have talked before about how it sort of seems like there are some similarities between Buddhism and Taoism, and obviously you're a big fan of
Sure.
Taoism. So what are your thoughts on Buddhism and what possible similarities and what the differences are in your opinion?
I mean, the thing about philosophical Taoism and Buddhism is that neither one requires faith. They are not faith-based religion per se. They're very much about what works. So, if you're talking about principles of how the universe works and what doesn't, Taoism and Buddhism have a similar orientation and recognizing some similar issues there. So, for example, the whole Buddhist Four Noble Truths idea, right? Where you have what exactly is the problem, which is the fact that there's a lot of suffering in life. What is that causes suffering? How is that you go out to deal with suffering? That's a very practical, it has a super pragmatic approach. It's not a religion in the classic sense. It's a very, very pragmatic approach to just problem solving. Taoism is very similarly pragmatic. It's all about how to get job done in the most effective way possible with the least amount of energy wasted. So in that regard, inevitably you're going to end up with similarities because they're both about tackling practical problems and solving them. So, like a classic example is Zen Buddhism, because Zen Buddhism was born in China under the name of Buddhism and Taoism. Zen is kind of like rather we
Oh, are you still there? You still there? I think something might have happened there. Can you still see me and hear me? Crap.
Okay,
You still
I'm
there?
here.
You still there?
Yeah, I don't know why connections to be coming and going.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, sorry. You got cut out when you were talking about the when Buddhism first came about in China. That's about where I lost you there. Oh crap. Uh,
There you go.
oh, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay. Did you hear what I just said there?
About Buddhism, yeah, when I got cut out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, basically what like Zen was Zen is a mix of Taoism and Buddhism. He was born in China when Buddhism was imported there, and he met native Taoism, and the mix of the two gave rise to Zen Buddhism, which is really a mix. Like you find a lot of Taoist themes within Buddhist context. And so, not all branches of Buddhism and not all branches of Taoism are identical or anything, but there are definitely, there's a lot of overlap.
Okay. You still there?
We're having a difficult connect day.
Yeah, it seems like we might have a bad connection there. Can you see and hear me again there?
Yep, I'm here.
Okay. Maybe you want to try continuing this just with our cameras off? Sometimes that helps.
I can hear you.
Okay. I can hear you too.
Okay, let's try that.
Okay, you still there now? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Maybe it'll be better to do it this way.
Let's try. Let's give it a
Okay.
shot.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. I don't know whose end it was, but yeah.
No worries. No problem.
Yeah, you were talking about some of the similarities there. Yeah, I didn't know about the similarities in the history between Buddhism and Taoism.
Yeah, and so in that regard, I find like I tend to use them interchangeably because there's a lot of like the stuff that interests me in Buddhism is the stuff that's applicable to anybody, regardless of whether they're Buddhist or not. The stuff that interests me in that goes along similar lines. Tend to find while there definitely are differences, there's also a lot of overlap.
Okay, that's cool. I didn't know that there were that many similarities. Yeah, I like the pragmatic aspects of Buddhism in particular too, just because I know a little bit more about that than I do about Taoism. But I really like that aspect too, like how you were talking about too, how you don't have to believe in any god or anything supernatural, anything like that. That's why I'm a big fan of both Buddhism and Taoism. And I didn't know that the particularly Zen Buddhism came out of such a similarity between that and Taoism too. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it was called the Chan Buddhism in China, and then that got renamed as Zen when it reached Japan. But yeah, that's basically the branch of Buddhism that's the most similar to Taoism. Like all the distrust of rationality that's characteristic of Zen, how they think rationality is a cool tool, but nothing more than that. That's a classic Taoist thing that you also find in Zen. You find, those kind of themes are they are big in both traditions.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's pretty cool. So, what would you say are the some of the differences?
I mean, a lot of it is organization, the way they are structured. In terms of, Zen Buddhism tend to be a little more rigidly structured in terms of hierarchy and the monastery and all of that. But even that is kind of like, because within Taoism, there's so much variety that there's probably as many differences between different branches of Taoism as there are between some branches of Taoism and other traditions. So it's not even that they're just one Taoism and one Zen Buddhism. There's so much that makes it inevitably a lot of what we end up saying is generalizations, because there's much variation across the spectrum.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it seems to me like the more you investigate stuff like that, like I guess certain types of religions, or depending on how you classify them, and like particularly different branches of philosophy too, when you get into them more, the more you get into them, it seems to be common to find out that there's a really wide variety of thinking and a lot of disagreement among what people who are considered to be the main thinkers in those different ways of thinking.
Most definitely. That's why all discussions, when we go kind of to the macro level, they are inevitably vague, because there are so many exceptions to every rule. You talk about any one religion, and whatever you say, it may be true, but also the opposite is probably true, because there are just a lot of variation. Now, you can kind of generalize about the general trend, a particular point in history in a certain tradition goes in this direction, but anything past that becomes a useless generalization.
Yeah, I think that's always important to remember, and I have to remind myself about that a lot too. And it's like I said, it's easier when you just try to make a point of learning about all of the as many of these sorts of things as possible, for sure. Um, so actually, I guess something else that I wanted to talk with you about, which is, um, and I was thinking about this because I know you're a fan of like warrior philosophy, and we talked about Conan before. So
Mhm.
I was curious about your thoughts about Musashi.
Musashi is interesting because there's a lot of romanticism around the Musashi story, and it definitely sounds like he could be a cool character. It's a little, I mean, Musashi also strikes me as a bit of a sociopath in a few ways, because he's clearly a guy who cares about one thing and one thing only, which is effectiveness with the sword. And every other aspect of human life kind of goes like it's all about for him is personal cultivation, so he does all these things. He never has kids. He doesn't really strike me as the friendliest type. He get into these duels after duel to establish supremacy for who's the better swordman. And while I very much dig the the combat aspect of it all, there's something about Musashi that seems a little psychotic. I mean, even when like he's a 13-year-old or something, and he challenged this top-notch samurai to a duel, and the guy, when he shows up for the duel, Musashi's a monk comes with Musashi saying, "Oh, please forgive this guy. He's only 13. He doesn't know what he's doing. Leave him alone." And the guy no sooner is saying, "Okay, sure, no problem," that Musashi just throws a stick at him, charges him while he's down, and kills him on the spot. you know Hard. It's easier to romanticize him if you kind of gloss over some of the historical facts. Some of the historical facts, which by the way are really hard to separate from the myth, don't make him sound like the most mentally well-adjusted guy in history.
Oh, so the way that he's painted in that novel called Musashi is probably like more of the mythologized version.
Yeah, thing I get is that the myth is a lot cooler than what the guy was really like.
Yeah, yeah, it sounds that way. What do you think about his like his basically his strategies that he lays out in the Book of Five Rings?
I mean, he's like, the whole Book of Five Instincts is something about strategy, right? Which, again, in that sense, as the Taoist, feel for it in terms of, how do you get the job done in the most effective way possible. Book of Five Instincts is pretty tricky to read. It's not the easiest because it's, the language uses and stuff tends to be, some of it is very fighting, and the parts that are not specific to sword fighting are not always easy to tease out. But it's definitely interesting. I mean, there are some points that he makes that are absolutely brilliant. That idea that the same stuff that allow you to master one particular discipline, in his case, a swordmanship, are the same that will allow you to master pretty much anything else. That's absolutely spot on. There are certainly quite a few quotes in there that are brilliant. No argument there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I forget how exactly the quote goes, but it's something like if you see the way broadly, you see the way in all things, or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really great quote. I think Joe Rogan talks about that one. Didn't he get a tattoo of Musashi or something like that?
Can't remember.
Okay. Yeah, like I like the just kind of like mythologized version of Musashi because he's just a total awesome badass, and I like the sort of philosophical lessons that are laid out throughout, especially that novel Musashi.
Mm-hmm. No, totally. And I
Yeah.
think that's where sometime I don't mind, if you take a historical thing which may or may not be true, but you turn it into something awesome, why not? If it
Yeah.
works, if it's, if you are saying this is the real history, yeah, you have a problem, but nobody's necessarily saying that. It's more like you're creating an archetype, which is totally cool.
Yeah. Yeah, and I know you've talked about that on your History on Fire podcast a few times before too, like how sometimes, especially if it's really hard to find original source material, it's
Mm-hmm.
more exciting to just like keep as historically accurate as possible, but weave it into an interesting story. And you do a good job in your podcast, I think, too, of just always clarifying that what you're saying is like not necessarily historically accurate. And there are a few different ways that it could have gone. It could have gone this way or this way or this way, but this one is the most interesting to me.
Yeah, exactly. Because ultimately, with history, there's a lot of guesswork involved, to say the least. So it's good to be honest. It's good to present what the various true options are. Not trying to pretend it's true just because you want it to be true. But then, as you're exploring the legends around it, you can just, let people make up their mind, and you can bring up why a particular story, which may or may not be true, is still worthy of our attention.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, yeah, one of the one of the other topics that I wanted to talk with you about was porn, which is and that one I thought of mainly because of your conversation with Connor Habib that you told me about on your Drunken Taoist podcast from, I think it was maybe from a year or so ago.
Sure.
And I thought it was interesting. Connor Habib is a really interesting guy. I've heard him on Thaddeus Russell's podcast too, and it's interesting his experience, hearing him talk about his experience as a gay porn star. And I like both of all three of your perspectives: your perspective, Thaddeus Russell's perspective, and Connor Habib's perspective on porn, and how there's such a huge social stigma against porn, and like it's kind of funny in a way because it's not like people get horny and sometimes they want to masturbate. So it seems like porn is a pretty valuable service in that way.
Yeah, it's I think it goes back to kind of the stigma that exists in general with sex in our culture, and for the matter, not just in our culture. There's a bunch of culture where the same applies. There seems to be specifically to American culture, we're comfortable with violence than we are with sex, which is kind of weird when you think about it.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
it's yeah, I feel that this degree of it's the same thing and end up in that subject talking about prostitution or things like that. It's like it's very odd that transaction between a voluntary transaction between adults should be legal unless you assume that there's something really particularly weird about the way we see sexuality. So that's where it's now. Having said that, one thing that I find kind of weird about porn, it tend to cater to just like everything is about fetish to some degree or another. It's like
yeah,
very little of what shows up on the screen as an actual parallel in the life of people.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
more really, which is why, if you're getting your idea about sex from porn, you're really looking down the wrong path because
yeah,
that's not the way it works.
yeah,
But so yeah, that part I don't like too much. It seems like super fetishized, even when it's indulged in, not as. But but other than that, the concept of it, the idea that why should there be a taboo about it? Yeah, that's just silly.
yeah, yeah. I know what you mean. Like the fact that it's such a taboo is kind of strange if you think about it. Like especially, I know I've been doing a video series on Foucault's book, The History of Sexuality, which is so
Hmm.
fascinating to me, like the way historically how modern culture sort of adapted the way we look at sexuality by putting it in the realm of science rather in the realm of art, and like putting these labels on people based on their sexual behavior that didn't exist before. And those are good points you made too um about how there's so many fetishes available in porn, and how it's all like, and how it's basically what we see online is like a fantasy. And it reminded me too of when you were talking with Connor Habib about this, about how, well, it seems like one common aspect of a lot of porn is like it's sort of like a really misogynistic version of it sometimes, unless you look for alternate ways of it. So I mean, there's so many interesting aspects of this to me.
No, totally, absolutely. Can you give me just 1 minute? That it looks like there's an emergency I need to take care of.
Oh yeah, yeah,
I'll be
sure.
right back.
Yeah, sure.
Ok, dimmi al volo.
So maybe some of you who watch this are aware of me making videos on Michel Foucault's book called History of Sexuality Part 1. Pretty awesome book. It's one of my favorite books that's sort of labeled as philosophy, but it's kind of more like history, really. It goes through the way that our cultural conception of sexuality has changed throughout history, particularly like the Western cultural conception, and how it was, I think, before around the 1600s or something like that. It was this was around the point when sex started being put into the realm of science, and then they created these categories and labels based on sexual behavior, like homosexuality and heterosexuality, whereas before then you could be free to just experiment with your sexuality and behave in any way sexually that you want to without being slapped with this label that you can never escape, really. And one of the aspects that I'll talk about until Daniele gets back here is that mm, it wasn't just that sex started to be looked at through the realm of science, and that there, like, it started to create these fetishes that we were talking about, that like anything that was not seen as quote unquote normal, like sort of boring sexual behavior, was seen as a fetish. So, and then if you went out of those categories, you were sinful and evil, and then the confession got involved with it too. So you had to confess the sins of your dirty sexuality.
Sorry, my man, I'm back.
Okay. I was just talking about the history of sexuality more.
Yeah, sorry, it's just today's a bad day. It's like one gram after another.
Yeah, I know what you mean. That's okay. Um, yeah, what are your thoughts on what I was just saying there in terms of I was just saying how it's you brought up some interesting points, and there are many interesting aspects to this whole porn idea in terms of how our cultural conceptions of sex changed and how science changed that, and how I was just talking to before you got back about how the confession, Foucault talks about how the confession gets involved with sexuality too, and we were talking before you had to go there about how it's interesting how there are just like fetishes everywhere in
Yeah.
porn, and how it's a fantasy and stuff like that. Like it's there are so many interesting aspects to it.
Yeah, it seems to really have changed dramatically in so many ways, and it's I mean, in some way, definitely good with the decline of organized religion being less of the driving factor that kind of oversees the discussion on sexuality. There's been a little bit more Western war in this regard, but it's still funny to notice how uncomfortable the topic is for most people, which is really weird when you think about it, because it's like it should be one of the most normal things in the world, and yet most people are really, really disturbed by it. They are, seriously, like you can watch video games and you can see 10,000 murders and anybody doesn't, nobody bats an eyelash. But if you show any kind of nudity, it's a big deal. And it says something about it. It really says something about where we're, and it's not the only aspect, because it's not that there's this Puritan heritage. On the other hand, you have the fact that, yes, so we have, if a woman goes topless on the beach, she can be arrested for indecent exposure. But at the same time, you have San Fernando Valley, which is the world capital of porn in LA. And it all happens in the same culture.
Yeah, that's
So
true.
there are between it, the push and pull there. But
Yeah,
yeah, all the taboos about sexuality are really bizarre in a lot of ways.
yeah. It's so interesting too, like what you were saying there with how a woman can get arrested for going topless in the same place where a whole lot of porn is produced. It's like that reminds me of a point that Foucault makes about it too, where it's like when you start to talk about sexuality more, when our culture started doing that, sexuality became something that you talked about, but in order to conceal it and demonize it. So like you were saying, like we all have. Sorry.
I'm here.
Oh, okay. I was just saying it like we all have sexual desires. Most people have sex, but it's like something that we don't talk about, even though it's a natural bodily function and experience.
Mm-hmm.
It is really bizarre that like I can go and talk about like what I ate for lunch with anyone, but there are some people that I wouldn't talk to about porn or sex or anything like that because it's not polite for public conversation, quote unquote.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, that's part of the discussion that's weird. And along with the other topics you are proposing at the beginning, what I find so bizarre about the policies in regard to prostitution. It really doesn't make like, I understand human trafficking. That's a whole different story. When you're talking about people who are forced into it, of course that should be legal. Of course there should be laws against it. Of course, all of that stuff. But the idea that you need to make all transaction involving sex for money legal, including the ones that have nothing to do with trafficking, that's bizarre. That's like, why? What exactly? What's the problem here? What are we talking about?
Yeah, exactly. Like the both your podcast that you did with Thaddeus Russell where you were talking about prostitution and just like hearing him talk about it more on his podcast, especially when he's interviewed actual prostitutes and sex workers. Like
Hmm.
one of the things that I was surprised to hear from them, people who actually work in this industry, is that, oh, it's not the case that all prostitutes are women who are just forced into it and they're traumatized all the time. Surprise, surprise, women like sex too, and some women like to have sex for money, and it's not necessarily like it's all just like sexual exploitation and stuff like that
Yeah.
too. Like it seems like a lot of people who seek out prostitutes are like guys who just want some type of intimacy, but maybe you don't want a relationship, or maybe you're just a lonely guy who can't get laid and you want some form of intimacy or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. The idea that everything, like they have to take the absolute worst case scenario and assume that that's the norm, that's just simply not true. You know, those things are real and they are bad and they should be kept at bay. But by
Of
the same
course.
token, there are plenty of cases that are not, that are much more, the same way as, you pay somebody to give you a massage and that's totally fine. But if it involves sexuality, suddenly it's a big deal. Yeah, that part I don't get. It just goes right over my head. I don't understand why. And I'm not saying, everybody should be comfortable with it personally. It's your choice. Either you are questioning it. But the idea that it shouldn't be legal for somebody else to engage in it if they are comfortable with it, that's just bizarre.
Yeah, I totally agree. Like it, yeah, like you were just saying, if you're not comfortable with it and you never want to have sex with a prostitute or something like that, there's nothing wrong with that at all in my opinion either. But if you want to prevent other people from doing it just because it's not comfortable to you, then that doesn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah. That's one of the weird things about it. And, like again, there are the exploitative scenarios for sure. There are also the ones that are not in any way, shape, or form. I knew one lady she spoke 6 languages, was a graduate from UCLA, had a great job. And on the side, she did things where she was very selective about her clients. And the way she saw it is, she kind of had a free love type of approach. Is sort of like I'm dating a lot and getting and making bank in the process. To her, it was that clearly qualified as prostitution, but is a very different kind from person on heroin kept as a sex slaves type of stuff. That's the problem with language sometimes, that we use the same word to refer to things that have nothing to do with one another.
Oh yeah, that's definitely an important point. And it's the I just thought of two different things in terms of this when you were talking there. Two completely different things. One of them is like this whole thing where they're they're like cam girls who like they'll be on Snapchat or something, and then they'll want you to pay for their dirty Snapchat or something like that. That seems like
Hmm.
obviously not actual prostitution, but pretty it's sort of like somewhere in between prostitution and porn to me. And to me, like
Hmm.
a similar aspect of that sort of thing with porn and prostitution is that people are allowed to do that, and I think they should be allowed to do that if they want to, even though they're so similar. And like the way that particularly maybe like the cam girls thing and maybe the something that can can become a problem maybe with porn in particular is if people start to look at sex as like this sort of transactional thing where it's just like superficial, which can be good like depending on who you are and what you're looking for and where you are in your life or something. Like you can have like friends with benefits scenarios, and that's totally fine too. But then if you look at it in a different way, like some people might want more intimacy out of it. Or another thing I was reminded of too is another way that Foucault talks about this is that when sex was seen as like more of an art than science being applied to it, he uses this term.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's no. He talks about how sex was a way of exchanging knowledge with another person. Like you learn from that person through that intimate experience. I think that's a really interesting way of looking at that.
Most definitely. That's why people assume that there's one approach to it. There isn't. There are like 10,000 different ones, and the overwhelming majority of not are not exploitative. So it really confusing the priorities. Whereas, making a priority of making sure that nobody gets exploited is definitely the ones of regulating sexuality among adults.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, like this is one of few topics that I actually have fairly radical views on. Like I have pretty like neutral positions on most topics, I would say, to the point that it often kind of annoys some people because I'm such a fence sitter sometimes. But in terms of in terms of things that are illegal that I think should not be illegal, I think prostitution and also all drugs should be
Yeah.
totally legal because for example I think with prostitution and with drugs, they generally become safer when they're more legalized. Like with prostitution, for example, at least ideally you could have like the like would go down, and like similarly to, like one aspect with drugs, for example, is like if you're talking, especially if you're talking about like maybe cocaine or some of the harder so-called harder drugs, then there's ideally more quality control, like you know what you're getting and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that may be part of a story right there. It's and it's interesting that we are having the discussion regarding drugs. There is definitely a conversation to be had regarding the war on drugs right now, as far as is this a good idea, is it not? Legalization of marijuana, maybe pushing further than that. There isn't at all a conversation regarding legalization of prostitution, which I find also kind of odd.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it? I mean, there are lots of people who are public proponents of legalization of drugs, but you don't really hear people talk about legalizing prostitution that much.
Mm-hmm. No,
You-
not at all. And I really have no idea why. Because it seems like a no-brainer to me.
Yeah, I mean, it seems that way to me too. I wonder if I don't know, do you think that at least one aspect of it is that we have this like sort of taboo mindset toward sexuality, and particularly someone paying someone else for sex, that we have like really embedded deep into our cultural conceptions of these topics?
Yeah, I think there's a high degree of, most people are uncomfortable with their own sexuality. And the only way they justify it is by telling some kind of fairy tales to themselves about, oh, it's about the ultimate form of love or something like very sort of, which again, don't get me wrong as well, but that's not the only thing that sex is. And so, but that's the only way that find. They find a way to justify it to themselves. And so when it's not in that scenario, when it's sex purely for pleasure, without love, without particular deep emotional connection, that drives them crazy.
Yeah, that makes total sense too. Like even me, for example, like when I was younger, I would have like more friends with benefits or like have sex with random women or something like that. And even when I like almost completely felt totally comfortable with that at the time, there was always just this small voice in my head that was saying like, oh, you're doing something bad. This is so bad. You're not
Mm-hmm.
doing the traditional monogamous relationship where you only have sex with where you're in love with someone.
Yeah, exactly. It's this notion that there should be one size fit all, that there should be one approach to it and anything else is bad.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so interesting. Like this is one thing that that Foucault talks about too, about how you create this one really specific category, and then other categories, those categories are bad. Those people are bad. It's like how when we first started putting labels on our sexual behavior, for example, like being heterosexual, that's the moral righteous way. And then if you're
Sure.
or I mean, if you're homosexual rather, or if you're anything else, you're sinful and evil, and you're going to die, and you're going to lead to the death of the entire Western civilization, which is
Yeah, exactly.
so
Exactly.
insane.
Which I think is where I find I have problems with people who seem to want to recycle kind of old Christian idea and bring them back in a more fashionable light today. I feel like, are you kidding me? Some of that stuff, let's run as fast as we can away from it for good reasons, because it has done tremendous damage to people's perceptions due to their fairly horrific views of sexuality.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Like, I mean, the um yeah, like one piece of that, for example, that I think is interesting is that a lot of people talk sometimes, particularly more conservative people, I would say, about how um, children benefit from having two parents in the household, and who grow up in single parent families don't turn out as well. And then in
Mhm.
maybe the more conservative version of this, and more conservative people, they would say it should be a man and a woman, which, and then so it's like it seems to me that maybe kids growing up with two parents of any kind, regardless of their gender, might be a good idea. But then there are also like there are always exceptions. Like there are single mothers who do better than parents who are together, and maybe there are two parents who are together but they hate each other, but they stay together for their children. But maybe they should really get divorced. But them hating each other damages their children. And I mean, it's so I totally know what you mean in terms of like recycling these old like Christian views of praising monogamy, like that's the best thing and stuff
Yeah.
like that. Like that's like learning more about postmodernism in particular has helped me be much more skeptical of those types of worldviews.
Most definitely. That's exactly where I'm at. I'm with you on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I know that's one of I guess we might have a little bit of time, and I know you've got some time constraints here, but maybe just before we go, we could get into a little bit of that in terms of, I know we were talking about Jordan Peterson a little bit before, and
Sure. I mean, yeah, that's exactly it. This idea that we need to enforce monogamy. And by the way, I understand what the way it means the word. It's not saying by law or the state will pass laws, but even that culturally, anything that is not monogamy should be shunned. It's like, the fuck is your problem? It's like, good for you if it works. I mean, that's one approach for sure. And I'm not saying it's bad, but to assume that that's the one and only, and anything else need to be is a threat to Western civilization, well, you're just a psycho at that point.
yeah, I'm like I'm always skeptical now when I hear anyone say anything followed by will lead to the death of Western civilization or something like that. Like, really? I'm really skeptical of that. Like, maybe you're right that there'll be bad consequences, maybe, but is that going to destroy all of Western civilization? I find that very hard to believe.
And even the bad consequences is way more complicated than that, because there are certain things for which monogamy is very good. There are certain things for which it's not. To oversimplify things in this way and to assume that if you got the 1950s family of the mom, father, 2.5 kids, cat, dog, and white picket fence, that's the way in which human life is supposed to be, get the fuck out of here. That's one approach. And again, I'm not spitting on it. There's something cool about it, but it's one out of probably 500 different approaches that can work. To
Yeah,
assume that that's the one and only and all others need to be squashed, come on.
yeah, yeah, totally. I mean, I'm thinking right now too. I'm being reminded of Chris Ryan in his book Sex at Dawn, where he talks about the more, I think the word is polyamorous relationships,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps that were prevalent in a lot of hunter-gatherer cultures. I mean, and there are so many different ways that people in different fields of science, and particularly social science, look at these things, that it does seem like you were saying, there are many different forms of relationships that work. And yeah, maybe monogamy was a common aspect of what people associate with the success of capitalism and Western civilization, but does that mean that it's such a crucial aspect to this whole project? And if this whole project, like if some of those things change, is it really going to be such a terrible thing? Like a lot of it seems like paranoia.
Completely. That's exactly the way I feel about it.
Yeah. I mean, that's why it's really interesting to see like how biased we can, like everyone can be about things, because I know I'm not immune to bias for sure. No one is, but it's so interesting how attached we get to our ideas and how we just can't break out of them, or we don't want to break out of them because we associate them as part of our identity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's exactly like this. And a lot of it is fear mongering. There's this fear that if we try something else, it's the end of the universe. And it's like, it's like, yeah, there are ideas that are stupid. Yes, there are things that will lead to bad outcomes, but no, not everything. No, it's this sense that we need to be scared about everything, and that's not the traditional picture perfect image that comes from the 1950s, is a little bizarre.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think I was talking about this with a few people on the Mixed Mental Arts Facebook group too, about something similar. I was talking about status symbols, and how some evolutionary psychologists talk about how men and women behave like sexually towards each other in terms of seduction based on status symbols. And
Mm-hmm.
I was really I was really skeptical that the majority of people act that way. But then and I still think it's not necessarily the case that even even the majority of men and women behave toward each other that way. But there were a few people who were sort of like reframing that to me too, like in terms of what you were talking about, like the nuclear family and traditional gender roles and stuff like that. It seems like it's becoming more the case that maybe they're stay-at-home dads sometimes instead of stay-at-home mothers, and maybe one or both of them work less so they can spend more times with their kids. And I was talking before recently on a podcast I was doing with Alex Bello about how people in my generation, like millennials and people like that, it seems like people in our generation and people younger than us are starting to get married at later ages, or maybe get married less often, and just sort of escaping that aspect of the sort of nuclear family where you would get married right out of high school, and then you would have the house and the car and 2 kids, and then you just sail off into the sunset, metaphorically speaking.
Yeah, 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 precisely. I completely agree there.
Yeah. All right. So I know you didn't have that much time. Unless there's anything else you want to talk about, we could end it here for now if you want to.
Yeah, all good, my man. I'm sorry that this period is really insane, and today got even worse. While we were on the phone, I have to take care of 10,000 things I didn't expect. So sorry about the lack of time, but we can definitely do more once I come up for air.
Yeah, no, that's okay, man. I really appreciate you talking with me as always, and this was fun, and I'm sure we'll have other things to talk about. One of the things I wanted to talk to you about, but I didn't get a chance to this time, was I wanted to read some of the Conan books because I haven't done that yet, and I think it would be fun to talk more about those too.
Yeah, check out all the Robert E. Howard stuff. There are others written by other people. They usually suck. Check out the Robert E. Howard.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll just say all the stuff I like to say at the end of my videos here, and then you can give any last words or plugs or anything. And I'll add the links for your books and stuff like I did with our last conversation.
Cool.
All right. So thanks everyone so much for watching slash mostly listening this time to another episode of the Mindgasms podcast. Hoped you found it as interesting as I did to talk with Daniele Bolelli about Buddhism, Musashi, porn and prostitution and cultural values and that sort of thing. And like I always say, thanks so much to everyone who has subscribed to my channel, and to those of you who like and share this video, and especially to those of you who support me on Patreon. I really fucking appreciate that, and it helps me out a lot. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe. And most importantly, always remember this: the funk cures all. All right, keep having mindgasms, everyone. And any last words or plugs there, Daniele?
Awesome, my man. No, all good. We'll just do another one at some point.
Awesome. All right. All right. Adios until next time, everyone.